So let's talk about trauma brain. What is trauma brain? So Daniel Siegel has the best explanation to me on how the mind works, and I love him because he is able to put these concepts in a very simple language. It helps me understand it, and I've been able to explain this to children, and they seem to really understand it as well. So we're going to use his language. We're going to talk about the upstairs brain and the downstairs brain. So the upstairs brain, this is the part of the brain where we're here, we're talking, we're learning, hopefully we're calm, and we're taking this information in. But in a situation where the brain interprets that there is a serious threat, then something automatic happens. This part of our brain, the downstairs part of the brain, which can also be, sometimes it's called the animal brain, the reptilian brain, this part of the brain will kick in gear and almost hijack the entire brain so that that person can stay alive. And that's when we begin to see the child or the adult go into fight, flight, or freeze. An example would be back to what I shared earlier about being in a pool of water. If a person is drowning and they're struggling to get to the surface, this part of the brain, the downstairs brain, will kick in gear and basically take over so that the person can get to the surface and stay alive. There's really no thinking involved. It's an automatic response, just like your heartbeat. John Rigg has an excellent TED Talk video that talks about how this part of the brain will kick in during danger or threat. And he uses an example with our veterans. And he said an example would be a veteran who came back from the battlefield, and maybe he's home with his family, he's having a great day, he goes to a concert, he's having a good time, and then all of a sudden the fireworks go off in the building. And the veteran hits the ground as fast as he can, and then a few seconds later he realizes what he did. He stands up and he wipes his pants off, and he's embarrassed, like, oh my goodness, I can't believe I just did that. You see, that is actually how we were made. That's how the veteran was made. When the brain interprets something as a threat. For example, the brain is not geographic specific. The brain heard the loud bang, the fireworks, and it reminded the brain of being on the battlefield and hearing the bombs. So there's no thinking involved. In order to keep that veteran alive, this part of the brain says duck, which of course can leave us feeling embarrassed, or that veteran's feeling embarrassed. But I want you to understand that that's actually an amazing way that we were created. The brain's going to kick in gear and keep us alive at all cost. Now let me give you another example. Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris has an excellent video, a TED Talk video, and excellent books, and she talks about the same concept with a bear. The downstairs brain, the animal part of your brain, the immediate reaction part of your brain kicks in gear. It sees the threat. We are not safe. We could die. Do you remember the 7 and 8 needs? We are not safe. We have to go now. So as soon as that happens, the brain is going to kick in gear, and this amazing process happens throughout the body. And I'm going to explain that to you, because when I began to learn how the brain works and how it begins to release neurotransmitters, it began to make so much sense to me on why we can do certain things to turn that system or those neurotransmitters down or off when it begins to flood our body. So the HPA axis begins to send signals. It sends signals to the pituitary gland, to the adrenal gland, and as soon as that happens, cortisol and adrenaline begin to pump throughout the body. It sends signals straight to the heart, and it begins to pump. The heart begins to pump blood faster and faster. Why does the heart need to pump blood faster? Because it needs to get blood to the arms and the legs to prepare your body to either fight that bear or flight that bear, run from the bear, or freeze. Now, I don't know about you. Some of you may be fighters, and some of the students and clients I've worked with before are little fighters by nature. They may fight the bear. Not Miss Shawna. Miss Shawna's gone. So when that happens, okay, that system overrides everything else and says this is most important, which makes sense. Another thing that happens is the adrenaline and cortisol go to your lungs and open your airways up so you can get plenty of oxygen so you can run out of the woods. Another interesting thing happens is tunnel vision kicks in. Because the brain interprets that we have to get out of the woods now. We don't need to worry about all of this. We have to get out now. And so tunnel vision happens so that we can get out of the woods. Now, when all of this is happening, another interesting system is operating as well. So all of this system that I just spoke about is called the sympathetic nervous system. It gets all of these chemicals and neurotransmitters running throughout our body so we can get out of the woods. Now the parasympathetic nervous system that's responsible for resting and digesting, okay, it recognizes that digesting that hamburger is really not that important right now. All of the energy, blood supply, and everything we have needs to go to the sympathetic nervous system so that we can all stay alive. And so it begins to suppress the digestion system. Okay? It also begins to suppress the immune system. It's responsible for the immune system. It also is responsible for reproduction. So all of these systems, resting, everything, digesting, everything over here becomes suppressed and put on the back burner so all of this energy can come over here and get us out of the woods. Now, why is that important to know? Well, one reason is because when that digestion system is suppressed, okay, think about all of our little children, our kids at school, our students at school who have belly aches, who have chronic belly aches all of the time, and maybe they visit the nurse and there's never really anything that they can find wrong with the belly, but the child is always complaining of the belly and headaches. Well, these children who are exposed to high levels of trauma or really chronic trauma, even though it may not be a physical bear that child encounters every day at school, when the bear comes home every night to that child, or maybe an abusive person or someone that's hurting that child, that stress release system, that fight, flight, or freeze system kicks in gear, and these children are staying in this high state of stress, and cortisol and adrenaline continuously flood through their little bodies. So that's why many times we see the digestion system not working, because they have high levels of stress and cortisol, and they're chronically in fight, flight, or freeze mode, which makes sense why we have students in class sometimes who are having meltdowns and just basically disrespectful and yelling and screaming, because you never know when we are going to be a trauma reminder to that child. When our voice is loud, when our behaviors, maybe we say or do something that reminds that child of that abuser, that downstairs brain is really smart, and it's going to do everything it can to keep that child alive and to keep that child fighting to keep going. So we have to remember that there are chemicals at play behind the scenes with these students who've been exposed to trauma and stress. They're not all just rotten kids, disrespectful kids. They really have a reason for their behaviors. So I want to share a bit more about that concept with the bear, because I want to begin to show you how you can actually help students get in charge and use manual overrides to turn that faucet, the cortisol and adrenaline drip, down, and help the parasympathetic nervous system to kick back in gear. And so they both work together in homeostasis, and parasympathetic and sympathetic is working well. One thing I didn't mention to you is we also have a lot of students who stay sick a lot. Well, you think about the suppression of the immune system, which all of this ties back into the ACEs study. These young children who stay in high states of chronic stress, and adrenaline and cortisol and all of these stressful or stress-related neurotransmitters are flooding their little bodies. No wonder when they're adults, they struggle with heart conditions or cancer or high blood pressure or diabetes. And of course, not everyone who struggles with those things had high levels of trauma, but we do know that there is a very significant correlation with these adults who have these serious health conditions, who had high levels of trauma as a child. So let's think for a second, let's go back to that situation with the bear. Once again, revisit that situation. Let's imagine that we have all of the neurotransmitters have kicked throughout our body, and we've ran out of the woods, and we look over and we realize that the bear is just as scared as we are, and the bear takes off running. So the thought comes to our brain, I'm safe now, right? The 7 and 8 needs, I'm safe now. When the brain realizes that you're safe, I want you to think about one of the first things that you would probably do if you get out of the woods. This is what I would do. Right? I'm going to start taking deep breaths because I'm out of breath because I just ran out of the woods. And every time I take those deep breaths, one of the things that some research says is that that deep breath is actually a signal to the brain that says, I'm safe now, you can turn that drip off. So we know the deep breath can actually turn off those stressful neurotransmitters and get us back to homeostasis, to where rest and digest and all of our systems are flowing together like they need to be flowing together. So the deep breath is actually a manual override to turn off that cortisol and adrenaline drip. Now, when I first became a counselor 17 years ago, I used to think deep breathing was so silly. I'm just being honest and confessing here. I thought it was so silly because it never slowed my brain down, and I didn't like it. I thought it was pointless. Now that I understand the mechanics behind the deep breath and that it actually can help send a signal to turn off the cortisol adrenaline drip, it makes so much sense. So we have to get our kids breathing, mindfulness, visualization, slow their breathing processes down. There's so many creative ways to do this. You can actually go online and find tons of books that are created for young students and older students to teach them to listen to their breath and just slow it down. A couple of my favorite are having students imagine that they're holding a hot cup of soup or even a hot cup of hot chocolate. And as they hold the soup, you want to get 6 to 7 deep breaths. Research shows that just 6 to 7 deep breaths of holding and blowing out, in and out, controlled breathing, can actually help turn off that cortisol adrenaline drip. So if your students in class are all over the place, maybe they're fighting, they're angry, or they're just wild because they came in from recess, pull out your hot soup or your hot chocolate and get them breathing. You basically just want to look at have them imagine it, have them breathe in either through their mouth or their nose, have them smell the aroma of the hot chocolate. As deeply as they can, have them hold it for 2 or 3 seconds, and then slowly, through controlled breathing, listen to their breath and cool down the hot soup. The goal is to get them to blow it out and blow out on the hot soup so it cools it down so they can drink it. 6 to 7 times are a manual override to slow down that drip. Another one is actually a yawn. There's a whole research that can be done on the polyvagal theory. I love it. It's really fascinating. But this kind of goes hand in hand with that system, at least how to slow down some of the neurotransmitters. But the yawn is actually a manual override to that drip, that high stress drip that runs throughout the body. So think about a dog. Have you ever seen a dog that runs through the field or runs down the road, and when it's exhausted and worn out, it'll sit down on the ground and it'll pant, and then it'll take these big yawns, and then it'll pant some more, and then it'll take a big yawn. Well, research believes that is how that dog, it's a universal signal that we're safe now, everything's okay, and it's basically trying to cool down its body and get things back to homeostasis, right? So start yawning. Your students come in, they start seeing you yawn. It's something that we all do. If you see a yawn, you're going to yawn, and actually that entire system is a manual override to that drip. I think about the Control-Alt-Delete on the computer. If you can't get it to shut down, you Control-Alt-Delete it, and sometimes you just got to reset. These concepts that I'm training you on are just simple ways to reset, especially if we have students who really need to connect and they need to learn how to get in control of these chemicals, because the deep ruts or neural activity that's happening in their brain is so deep that it's going to take a lot of manual overrides to change the chemical responses, the neurotransmitters in their brain. Another manual override is a smile. Through a simple smile, you can actually affect another person's neurotransmitters in their brain simply from smiling. So the power of the smile is huge and important. It's actually a right brain response we're going to talk about in a little bit. But by simply smiling at someone across the room, the muscles in my cheek from the smile signal my brain and actually cause endorphins or feel-good chemicals to flood down throughout my body and help me relax and feel good. So practice the smile. Let's show your big, beautiful pearly whites. So you might be in class and your students are all there thinking you're crazy because you're just smiling really big, and they're like, what is she doing? Just wait, you'll get the kids giggling, they'll laugh. They may think you're silly or crazy, but it's okay. Because what you're doing is you're causing endorphins to flood through their body. And sometimes you need that, especially on Maslow's hierarchy, so you can get them calm, feeling good, so they can be here and they can learn in your classroom. So a lot of these strategies are not just for the emotional behavioral piece, but also academically. We have to get them breathing calm and in a good place, once again, so they can learn, grow, and thrive at their greatest potential. Daniel Siegel talks about how when we right brain connect with a child, and once again, we'll talk about that in a few minutes, but when we right brain connect with a child, when we cause that connection, we can be on the other side of a room and not even touch them, but just smile or say a kind word. And just by doing that alone, it's like taking a water hose and pouring or putting the water on the fire inside of their little brain when they're in that high state of stress. It's like just putting water on the fire to calm them down and cool it down, which would create a response, and they would move from downstairs brain to upstairs brain, all simply from a kind response or a facial expression or a kind gesture. We really have the ability to affect students and our own children's chemicals, neurotransmitters in their brain. How neat is that? You may recall a few minutes ago when I talked about how when we go into fight, flight, or freeze, how our eyes will fixate. When the sympathetic nervous system is in gear, it will cause fixation. Well, if you think about our students who are high trauma, or students who fixate a lot. Maybe they have neurodivergent, super fast brains. I also see that a lot with my students and clients I work with on the spectrum. Their brains, the way I see it is their brains just go super fast. And so that fixation really can be a result of that cortisol drip that's just running throughout their body. So the deep breathing is good, finding ways to get that fast-paced river to just slow down a little bit in their brain. So one manual override is to tap the sides of the eyes and blink a lot. That can actually help pull them out of fixation and help them release a different neurotransmitter and turn that drip off. So that is another way that you can actually try to manually override that system. And the last one I want to talk about is visualization. This is so powerful. When I learned this concept, I realized just how powerful the mind is. So think about your Olympians. Before they go into an event, an Olympian will actually visualize the entire event before it happens. And a big reason that they do that is because they want to make sure that they're in the right headspace before the event happens. Because if they go into an event and they get nervous or stressed out and they move to this part of the brain and they're not thinking through it, or it's like going into a soldier mode and they're in fight, flight, or freeze. Olympians do not have a few seconds to make a mistake or think through what's going to happen. So they will visualize the entire event from the upper brain, the upstairs brain, so that they know exactly what to do when they get into that situation. They've already worked through any possible scenarios that could go wrong. Well, research tells us that by doing that, they create a neural connection, a new neural connection by just visualizing. Well, research also tells us that when they get to the actual event, they will use that same neural connection that they imagine. They will use the exact same one when they actually compete in the event. They will also use the same neurotransmitters that they used from visualizing it in the event as well. So once again, the power of visualization is amazing because it's actually creating neural pathways, which looks like vines in a garden. And so I think that's an important concept to grab a hold of, is the power of imagining and visualizing with your students. In the seed digging approach, when we use the one-on-one piece that school counselors can use and therapists, we talk about the concept of visualizing unconditional love and acceptance, whatever that is for the child or the adult, right beside you. I think about my Meemaw. I think about my Meemaw and my other grandma, and just imagining them standing beside me automatically makes me smile. My heart feels good. I feel happy inside from just thinking about them and how much they loved me. Well, that response, that warm feeling I have in my heart is a neurotransmitter. It's an endorphin that's being released from a thought of my grandmas being beside me and knowing that they love me and they just think that I'm cool. Now let's take a moment to talk about left brain versus right brain. Daniel Siegel has some excellent information on this, and I encourage you to watch his YouTube videos and even read his books. He's just brilliant. He has some brilliant information on this. But he talks about how our left brain and right brain are very different. Left brain, right brain responses are very different. And he says that left brain cannot connect with right brain. Some examples of left brain would be when we parent or when we teach and we say very direct statements like, do this, do that, or why'd you do this, or why'd you do that? He talks about an example of a little 8-year-old girl who comes home from school one day and her friends haven't been very nice to her, and she tells her mom, she says, my friends aren't nice to me, no one likes me, they were mean to me, nobody wants to be my friend. And he said a typical left brain response is, well, then don't play with them anymore. Or, what'd you do? Which kind of makes me smile a little because I'm sure in my lifetime I've done the same thing. And even though left brain responses have a place and children need direction and they need discipline, they need to understand things, if we do not right brain connect first, it can actually shut down that communication, causing that child to feel even more like no one cares about them, or they don't have a voice, or they don't matter, which goes back to those 7 and 8 needs. So it's really important to connect with our children first through a right brain response. Daniel Siegel also says that humans cannot grow without connection. And we talked a little bit about that earlier in the videos, but it's so important that we connect first and then move into left brain. Another example is, my grandparents and great-grandparents were raised during the Great Depression era. And during that period of time, there wasn't really a room for a lot of feelings or right brain responses. It was pretty much pull your bootstraps up and go to work, because if you don't work, we don't eat. That generation had it pretty tough. And so it was very much direct, black and white, this is how it is. But even though that generation was wonderful in so many ways and helped push our world forward with work ethic and getting things accomplished, they really didn't teach us how to feel. And it's so important to realize that this generation is different than that generation. This generation is exposed to so many other things through internet, social media. I encourage you to watch The Social Dilemma on Netflix, and just how social media and Instagram and just different things that our children are exposed to, how it's changing their brain through the dopamine drip and the neural pathways that are being connected simply because these programs are built to keep them wanting more. So we're seeing an entire generation with brain changes because of what they are exposed to. So it's so important, once again, that we bring right brain concepts in. Now, what is a right brain concept? What is a right brain connection? Daniel Siegel says that right brain are all those ways that we can communicate and not necessarily verbal. Right brain connection is our tone of voice, our gestures, our posture, our facial expressions. And when we connect with a child, when we right brain connect with a child, simply through our words and our actions, we can actually affect the neurotransmitters in their brain. Simply through a right brain connection, we can cause soothing neurotransmitters to flow down from the upstairs brain to the downstairs brain, calm them in their place of high stress and trauma, and cause them to come back up to the higher level thinking brain, where we meet them with the left brain response. And I think that's so interesting that just from a simple gesture, posture, or tone of voice, I can impact my child or a client or a student's neurotransmitters in their brain. And I think that's really, really important and something that we should focus in on. So an example, when he talks about the young lady who comes home from school and she's sad and she's upset, a right brain response really is not a way to fix it. It's just a way to be present with her and to say something that communicates, I care and I'm so sorry. It could be something as simple as, man, it must be tough being a kid these days. It is. It's awful, right? Giving them that chance to connect and feel them, empathize, sit in that place with them. And then you can move to left brain, because left brain is very important. Children need consistency, discipline, boundaries. But move into left brain and then say, now let's talk about this, because these are the same ones that you've struggled with each week. How could we do that differently? So remember, right brain and left brain both have their place. But if we respond with the left brain approach, we can easily shut that down, that communication, causing that child to feel even more strongly with what they felt in the first place, like no one cares. Now, let me make sure I say and remind everyone that we do not want shame to get our thoughts or for you to feel bad, because I always go back to, as a parent, I have sowed sad seeds into my children's hearts, and I have left a brain to response them, and I'm a counselor and should know better. But like Maya Angelou says, we do the best we can with what we have, and when we know better, we do better. When I was a child, we really didn't have these tools. I'm thankful now we have these tools that we're learning, and the mental health world is growing, and research is helping us learn so many more ways to affect the brain and to help our students overcome and even begin to heal, grow, and thrive at their greatest potential. I would love for us to take a moment to do the activity of the left and right brain exercises. I encourage you to partner up and just role play. Take one part as the student and one part as the parent or the teacher, and then when you've completed that, switch places. And you want to start by choosing a scenario and then applying a right brain response or a left brain response, and then vice versa. And I want you to pay attention to your body, and I want you to think about how you feel when you are the student and the teacher responds to you having a bad day with a left brain response that's listed on the worksheet, such as, suck it up, buttercup. I want you to think about how that makes you feel. Would it make you feel loved and cared for, or would it make you think, see, nobody really cares? And that's why it's so important to connect with the child first, try the right brain connection, and then move into left brain and see how you feel differently. Pay attention to your body, because every time you feel the happy, feel-good feelings, the warm feelings, that's endorphins, feel-good chemicals, neurotransmitters. And when you feel the negative tone or the harshness, that's the stress neurotransmitters that you're feeling, and the tightness and the heaviness maybe in your shoulders. So it's important to understand how our students and how our children feel when we do not connect with them first. Here's another quick concept that I want to throw in that I believe is so important when we are parenting and when we're teaching and leading children, is the concept to separate the weed from the garden. So many times a child automatically believes there's something wrong with them, or they're bad, or what should I have done differently. Really, the way that we're made, that happens simply because the way that we are made. Let me give you an example. If a young child who is a concrete thinker looks outside and sees a tree that is brown, and that child knows his colors, but yet his parents or a trusted adult tells him, oh no, that tree is purple, that tree's purple. Well, in a concrete little mind, and the brain of course is underdeveloped in those early years, that child has two options in their mind. One, I know my colors, I know that tree is brown, but I know my parents or that person would never lie to me, so you know what? It must be my eyes. There's something wrong with my eyes. There's something wrong with me. That's a control mechanism as humans we tend to do. It's way easier to control that than to think that my adult, that person I care about, would lie to me. So it's so important to remember that when we work with children, we want to begin to speak to the garden and help that child see themselves for who they are and not identify themselves based on the weeds, successes or failures. Because their identity is not that they're an excellent basketball player, that they're an excellent football player, they're a phenomenal singer. No, you are you, and you are loved and important. These are amazing things, but this isn't who you are. I'll give you some examples of this. You know, Michael Phelps, in 2012, had already won more than double the amount of gold medals than anyone in history, but yet he was very depressed, had suicidal thoughts, was on drugs and alcohol, and said that the Olympics at that time, doing the Olympics, was the worst time of his life. He hated being there. And when people asked, how in the world could this man who has fame and fortune and everything at his fingertips and has set history and won more gold medals than double of anybody else in history, how could he say that? His response was very simple. He said, here's why. He said, I had no self-love and no self-worth. I was just a swimmer. You see, when humans identify themselves based on their successes or their failures, eventually that's not going to be good enough, or there's not enough. We have to remember that humans are the gardens. We are not the weeds. How many famous people identified themselves based on their actions or their successes and failures? The famous actors and actresses and musicians. And when their career was over, their life was over. How many people have fallen prey to suicide simply because their identity was rooted in their actions and their successes and failures? We have tendencies to judge a book by its covers, a garden by its weeds. It's so important that we separate and help the child see himself through the eyes of love and acceptance, because when they're younger, their brains just can't always see it. Some examples of how to do that when disciplining or when speaking to a child is speak to the heart and separate the weeds. For example, teach a child, you are kind, but let's teach your hands to be kind like your heart. You are respectful, young lady. Let's teach your words to be respectful like you are. Separate, because once again, our society has a tendency to make the identity of the person their behaviors, their successes and failures, and we have to help students and children begin to pull away from that. Keep in mind that this is a language, seed digging is a language, and it's not something that you will maybe pick up overnight. Maybe focus on one or two concepts and begin to put it into action if you're a teacher with one child, or maybe your own children. And in time, the language gets easier. It really does get easier.